Some people think stealing a house is impossible until they watch an HOA president smile while holding your front door key. The first thing I noticed wasn't the smoke curling from the stone chimney. It was the smell of fresh cedar burning in a fireplace that should have been cold. Then came the sound. Laughter drifted through the pine trees, carried by the crisp mountain air that I hadn't breathed in almost 14 months. My tires crunched across the familiar gravel road one slow rotation at a time as morning fog rolled over the valley like a blanket trying to hide something it couldn't protect forever. Every bend in that narrow road carried a memory. Every towering pine had watched me grow from a barefoot kid chasing squirrels to a civil engineer who spent half his career building bridges across the Rockies. My name is Ethan Walker. I'm 36 years old, and that mountain cabin sitting 2,000 feet above the nearest town wasn't just another piece of real estate. It was the last place on earth where my father's laugh still echoed every time the wind swept through the trees. He built that cabin with his own hands before I was born, hauling lumber across the same wooden bridge that crossed Eagle Creek, one pickup load at a time. He always told me that the bridge mattered just as much as the cabin because without it, nothing reached the mountain. Every board, every steel bolt, every support beam had been carefully inspected every spring. I helped him replace planks before I was even old enough to drive. He used to pat one of the weathered railings and grin. A house can belong to anybody with a deed, son. But whoever controls the bridge controls the mountain. At the time, I thought he was just talking like old mountain men always do. Years later, I finally understood exactly what he meant. The closer I drove, the less the place looked like home. Flower boxes I had never installed hung beneath the windows. Decorative flags with the Willow Ridge Estates logo fluttered beside my porch. Someone had painted the mailbox dark green instead of the weathered brown my father always insisted matched the surrounding forest. A polished wooden sign stood beside my driveway. Willow Ridge Mountain Retreat. Private HOA property. Members only. I stopped my truck so suddenly the coffee inside my travel mug splashed across the dashboard. My heartbeat slowed instead of racing. Years working around construction sites had taught me something valuable. Panic clouds judgment. Calm reveals details. I stepped out into cool mountain air filled with pine sap, damp earth, and wood smoke. The silence between distant birds somehow felt louder than shouting. Fresh tire tracks crossed my driveway. Expensive SUV tires. High-end all-season tread. Someone had been coming and going for weeks. Maybe months. As I walked toward the porch, I noticed something else. My father's old rocking chair was gone. In its place sat matching wicker furniture with bright cream cushions that looked completely out of place against rough cedar logs. The front door opened before I reached it. Standing there with one hand resting confidently against the frame was Claire Whitmore, president of the Willow Ridge Estates HOA. 52 years old. Perfectly pressed cream sweater. Designer hiking boots that had probably never touched actual mud. Blonde hair styled like she'd just stepped out of a real estate magazine instead of a mountain wilderness. She smiled the way people smile when they believe they've already won. "Can I help you?" she asked politely, looking at me as though I had wandered onto her property by mistake. Behind her, I could see strangers drinking coffee in my living room. My father's stone fireplace crackled. Family photographs had disappeared from the mantel. The old elk antlers he'd mounted 40 years earlier had been replaced with framed HOA welcome signs. One man carried a plate of pancakes through my kitchen like he'd lived there his entire life. Claire folded her arms and tilted her head. "I'm afraid this retreat is reserved for HOA members only." She had no idea that every single person standing behind her had reached that porch by crossing something that still belonged entirely to me. I stood there for several seconds without saying a word because I had learned a long time ago that silence makes people reveal far more than arguments ever will. Claire kept smiling, completely convinced she was looking at another confused property owner who would eventually accept whatever paperwork the homeowners association placed in front of him. The smell of maple syrup drifted through my kitchen window while someone laughed inside the dining room where my father used to spread county survey maps across the old oak table every Sunday afternoon. It felt unreal, but not because strangers occupied my cabin. What unsettled me most was how comfortable they looked. They had already decided this place belonged to someone else. Claire finally broke the silence. She asked if I had business with the association and suggested that future visitors schedule appointments before driving onto private community property. Her voice carried the polished confidence of someone who had repeated the same speech dozens of times. I looked beyond her shoulder instead of answering. The old cast-iron skillet hanging above the fireplace was still there. The stone chimney still carried the faint scent of cedar smoke that my father preferred because he insisted it burned cleaner than pine. Even after 14 months away working on bridge inspections across western Montana, I could have walked through that cabin blindfolded. I knew where every floorboard creaked. I knew which kitchen cabinet stuck every winter when humidity dropped. I knew exactly how afternoon sunlight crossed the living room floor in October because I had watched it happen every year since I was 6 years old. My father, Daniel Walker, believed ownership meant responsibility more than privilege. While other fathers spent weekends watching football, mine handed me a toolbox and taught me how to replace roof shingles before teaching me how to drive. He believed every piece of land deserved someone willing to understand it. During spring runoff, we inspected Eagle Creek together, measuring water levels beneath the bridge with an old aluminum yardstick that still leaned inside the utility shed. During autumn, we cleared fallen branches before the first snow because mountain roads did not forgive lazy preparation. Those lessons eventually shaped my career. I became a civil engineer specializing in rural transportation infrastructure, spending years inspecting aging bridges throughout the Rocky Mountains. Friends joked that I trusted bridges more than people. Maybe they were right. Bridges followed engineering principles. People often followed ambition. After my father passed away 3 years earlier, the cabin became mine through a straightforward probate process. No siblings challenged the inheritance. No distant relatives appeared with surprise claims. Everything had been properly recorded with the county courthouse decades earlier. The property covered nearly 70 acres of timber, granite outcroppings, and untouched mountain meadows surrounding the cabin. There were no neighboring homes for almost 2 miles. The nearest paved highway sat nearly 9 miles downhill. Privacy had always been the greatest luxury that mountain offered. Before accepting my latest engineering contract, I winterized the cabin, locked every window, shut off unnecessary utilities, and hired a local caretaker named Walter Simmons to check the place twice each month. Walter was 70 years old, retired from the Forest Service, and knew every trail on that mountain better than any satellite map ever could. If a tree fell across the access road, Walter usually cleared it before anyone even called the county. He believed coffee should be black, conversations should be honest, and paperwork should always stay inside waterproof folders. I trusted him because my father had trusted him for more than 30 years. That trust made what I was seeing even harder to understand. My eyes drifted toward the edge of the porch where a brand new brass plaque had been bolted into one of the cedar posts. It displayed the Willow Ridge Estates emblem along with the words Official Mountain Retreat. Fresh drill marks surrounded the screws. They had not even tried matching the weathered wood. Claire noticed where I was looking and smiled with obvious pride. She explained that the board had invested considerable money renovating the property to benefit the community. New furniture, updated landscaping, improved guest accommodations, and scheduled member retreats throughout the summer. She spoke as though she expected gratitude instead of questions. Then she casually mentioned that abandoned properties often required decisive leadership before they became liabilities. That single word settled heavily in my mind. Abandoned. My father would have laughed at that description. He spent 40 years making sure that mountain remained anything but forgotten. And somewhere beneath Claire's polished explanation, I could already hear the first loose thread waiting to unravel everything she believed she owned. Claire stepped onto the porch and quietly pulled the front door closed behind her, almost as if she wanted to keep me from seeing any more of what had once been my home. The heavy cedar door latched with the same deep click I had heard thousands of times growing up, except now it sounded unfamiliar, like someone else had claimed ownership of memories that were never theirs to begin with. She folded her arms and looked at me with the patient expression of a woman explaining obvious facts to a stubborn child. "You really should have contacted the association before coming up here," she said. "We have procedures for situations like this." The mountain breeze carried the scent of wild sage across the porch while a hawk circled high above the valley. I simply asked one question. "Where is Walter Simmons?" For the first time, her smile flickered. Only for a heartbeat, but I noticed. People who spend their careers inspecting steel structures learn to notice tiny shifts before larger failures appear. She recovered almost immediately. The previous caretaker retired. We hired someone more cooperative. Cooperative. Another interesting choice of words. Walter had never mentioned retiring. In fact, only 3 weeks earlier he had mailed me photographs showing fresh snow around the cabin and a handwritten note reminding me to inspect the bridge railings before spring runoff. I still had that letter folded inside my truck. Claire continued, speaking as though she were delivering a prepared presentation. She explained that the Homeowners Association had spent nearly a year improving the surrounding mountain properties, creating hiking trails, organizing environmental cleanup weekends, and increasing local property values. According to her, my cabin had become an unfortunate problem because nobody had occupied it for an extended period. She described it as neglected, unsafe, at risk of vandalism. Every sentence sounded polished enough to belong in a real estate brochure. Then she casually informed me that the association board had voted unanimously to preserve the property for community use until ownership questions could be resolved. Ownership questions. I almost smiled hearing those words. There had never been ownership questions until someone decided to invent them. A silver luxury sport utility vehicle sat beside my workshop where my old pickup usually rested. Another pair of expensive crossovers occupied the gravel parking area near the woodshed. Their tires had flattened fresh pine needles into the driveway, leaving crisp tread patterns across gravel that I personally spread with my father almost 20 years earlier. The mountain remained exactly as I remembered it. Only the people had changed. Claire noticed my attention drifting toward the vehicles. Our guests appreciate having a peaceful retreat away from the city, she said proudly. This place has become one of the association's most popular amenities. Guests, amenities, community asset. Every description moved a little farther away from the simple truth that this was my family's home. Through the front window, I spotted one of the visitors carrying my father's old coffee mug. The faded blue enamel cup still had a tiny chip near the handle from the day I accidentally dropped it while helping repair the chimney. My chest tightened, not with anger, but with something quieter. It felt like watching strangers rewrite your family history one small detail at a time. Claire reached into a leather folder tucked beneath her arm and produced several neatly organized documents inside plastic sleeves. She held them carefully, making sure I could see official-looking county forms, printed maps, and multiple signatures. Everything has been reviewed, she assured me. The association followed legal guidance throughout the process. She spoke with complete confidence, but she never actually handed me the papers. Instead, she kept them angled toward herself, revealing only enough to create the impression of authority. That habit alone told me more than the documents ever could. Engineers spend countless hours reviewing permits, surveys, inspections, and construction contracts. Honest paperwork invites inspection. Questionable paperwork stays just out of reach. While Claire continued describing board resolutions and community improvements, I noticed something else. The county parcel map displayed inside one sleeve had been printed recently. I recognized the formatting immediately because my office used the exact same geographic information system software when reviewing bridge projects. The parcel boundaries looked unusually clean, almost too clean, as though someone had redrawn them using modern mapping instead of older survey records. Most people would never notice that difference. I did. She mistook my silence for surrender. Her shoulders relaxed. Her voice became softer, almost sympathetic. Mr. Walker, sometimes people simply move on. The mountain deserves someone willing to care for it. I looked past her toward the narrow road disappearing into the trees, the same road ending at the weathered wooden bridge crossing Eagle Creek. Hidden behind tall pines, it remained completely invisible from where we stood, but I knew every inch of it by heart. Claire clearly believed the cabin was the prize. She had spent months decorating rooms, welcoming guests, and hanging association signs. She had carefully claimed everything she could see. The one thing she had never bothered to understand was the only thing my father ever warned me never to overlook. I kept my voice calm and asked the simplest question I could think of. May I see the documents? Claire did not move. Her fingers tightened slightly around the leather folder before she answered with another polished smile. Our attorneys have advised us not to distribute copies while the review process is ongoing. That sentence told me everything I needed to know. If someone truly owns a property, they rarely hesitate to show the paperwork. They usually cannot wait to prove they are right. Instead, Claire shifted the conversation back to community improvements. She pointed toward a newly built fire pit overlooking the valley where my father once stacked split oak beneath a weathered tarp. Decorative lanterns hung from pine branches that had never needed decoration. Solar pathway lights lined the trail, leading toward the guest cabins that did not actually exist. They had turned my family's mountain retreat into something resembling an exclusive vacation rental, complete with matching patio furniture, branded coffee mugs, and little wooden signs reminding visitors to respect association property. Every improvement looked expensive. None of it belonged there. I glanced toward the equipment shed and immediately noticed the heavy brass padlock hanging from the door. Mine had been a simple steel lock with faded blue paint that I had installed years earlier after replacing the roof. Someone had removed it. The workshop held thousands of dollars worth of tools collected by 3 generations of my family. Survey equipment, chainsaws, welding gear, old bridge maintenance records stored in waterproof filing cabinets. I asked Claire who had authorized changing the locks. She answered without hesitation. The board approved new security measures after determining the structures had been abandoned. There was that word again. Abandoned. I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out my truck keys. Attached to the ring was a worn brass key with tiny scratches along one edge. My father handed it to me the day he officially transferred ownership of the cabin. Never lose this, he had said. Not because it opens the front door, because it reminds you that responsibility is carried, not inherited. I stepped toward the porch. Claire quietly moved sideways until she blocked the entrance. She never touched me. She simply stood there with complete confidence, convinced she had every legal right to decide who crossed that threshold. Behind the front window, one of the guests looked outside while sipping coffee from my father's chipped blue mug. Another unfolded a hiking map across my dining room table. They smiled, completely unaware that every photograph on those log walls had once shown birthdays, Christmas mornings, fishing trips, and family reunions stretching back more than 4 decades. To them, it was another luxury mountain retreat. To me, it was the last place where my parents still seemed close enough to hear. A white pickup truck rolled slowly into the driveway, kicking up a cloud of fine gravel dust that floated through the cool morning sunlight. The county sheriff stepped out, adjusted his campaign hat, and walked toward us with the relaxed pace of someone responding to what he believed was another routine property disagreement. Claire greeted him before I could say a word. She shook his hand, smiled warmly, and explained that an unidentified visitor had arrived insisting the retreat belonged to him. The sheriff turned toward me politely. "Sir, do you have identification?" I handed him my driver's license. He studied it, then looked back at Claire. She immediately produced a neatly organized folder containing printed meeting minutes, maintenance invoices, landscaping receipts, and several pages stamped with county recording information. Again, she never actually handed over anything that clearly established ownership. She simply presented enough paper to create the appearance of authority. The sheriff listened carefully before asking me if I had property records available. I told him every recorded deed remained at the county courthouse and digital copies were backed up through my attorney's office in Billings. I also explained that I had returned from a 14-month bridge inspection contract only hours earlier and had expected to unlock my own front door. The sheriff nodded thoughtfully. The breeze carried the sharp scent of pine resin, while somewhere farther down the mountain Eagle Creek continued flowing beneath the old wooden bridge with the same steady rhythm I had heard since childhood. Finally, the sheriff sighed. "Mr. Walker, this appears to be a civil property dispute. I cannot remove anyone today without a court order or immediate proof of ownership." His answer did not surprise me. Claire thanked him before I had the chance. She looked at me with quiet satisfaction, convinced another official had accepted her version of events. As the sheriff walked back toward his truck, he leaned closer and spoke softly enough that only I could hear. "If you really own this place, gather every original record you have. New paperwork can be created. Old records usually tell a different story." Then he tipped his hat, climbed into his pickup, and drove away. Claire watched him disappear around the bend before turning back toward me with the confidence of someone celebrating a victory far too early. She believed the mountain belonged to whoever occupied the cabin. I knew ownership often depended on something much older than fresh paint, expensive furniture, or recently printed documents. I looked at Claire one last time before turning around and walking back toward my truck. She probably expected shouting, threats, or one last emotional plea before I drove away. Instead, I closed my door, started the engine, and let the familiar rumble echo through the trees as I slowly headed back down the mountain. My father always believed that the first person to lose control of their emotions usually lost the argument soon afterward. The scent of warm pine needles drifted through the open window, while sunlight flickered between tall lodgepole pines lining the narrow access road. Every curve reminded me that mountains rewarded patience and punished shortcuts. By the time I reached the small town at the base of Eagle Ridge, I already had a plan. The county courthouse occupied an old sandstone building that smelled faintly of paper, polished wood, and decades of history. I spent nearly 3 hours requesting copies of every recorded document connected to our property. The clerk recognized my family name immediately. "Walker Mountain?" she asked with a friendly smile. "Those records go back a long way." She disappeared into the archive room while I waited beneath humming fluorescent lights. When she returned, she carried a stack of certified copies nearly 3 inches thick. Warranty deeds, tax records, survey maps, easement agreements, property tax receipts stretching back almost 50 years. Every page confirmed exactly what I already knew. The cabin belonged to me. The surrounding acreage belonged to me. The access road belonged to me. Nothing in those records mentioned any transfer to the homeowners association. Nothing even hinted at shared ownership. That should have been enough, but experience had taught me that facts alone rarely ended complicated disputes. I drove directly to an attorney in Billings who specialized in real estate litigation. His office overlooked the Yellowstone River and framed aerial photographs of ranches covered nearly every wall. After studying the documents for almost an hour, he leaned back in his chair and removed his glasses. "Your ownership appears solid," he said. "But possession is another matter. They are occupying the property. If they claim abandonment, adverse possession, or emergency management authority, untangling everything could take months." Months. The words settled heavily in the room. Every extra week meant more strangers sleeping in my father's bedroom, drinking coffee beside his fireplace, and treating my family's memories like resort decorations. The attorney estimated legal expenses that climbed well into 5 figures if the association fought aggressively. Filing motions, depositions, survey experts, title specialists, court hearings. The numbers sounded less like legal advice and more like the budget for building another bridge. I thanked him, collected my papers, and stepped back into the afternoon sunshine. The crisp autumn air carried the smell of fallen cottonwood leaves drifting along the riverbank. For the first time all day, frustration began pressing against my calm. Not because I doubted my ownership, but because I understood how easily organized paperwork could overwhelm obvious truth. Before leaving town, I stopped by Walter Simmons's small cabin on the edge of the national forest. His pickup sat exactly where it always had, parked beneath an old ponderosa pine with a faded Forest Service sticker still clinging to the rear window. I knocked twice before his wife, Helen, opened the door. Her eyes softened the moment she recognized me. She invited me inside without saying much. The living room smelled of black coffee and cedar furniture polish. Walter sat beside the window with his right leg elevated after knee replacement surgery. He looked embarrassed before I even asked what had happened. He explained that Claire had visited several months earlier with 2 board members and informed him the association had assumed responsibility for the mountain property. They claimed updated county records showed new management authority. When Walter questioned the paperwork, they told him his caretaker services were no longer required and warned that returning without authorization could expose him to trespassing complaints. Walter admitted he believed something felt wrong from the beginning, but recovering from surgery had kept him away from the mountain. Then he reached toward an old oak cabinet beside his chair and slowly pulled out a weathered metal cash box. "I almost forgot," he said quietly. "Your father told me years ago that if anything ever seemed unusual, I was supposed to give this to you and nobody else." Inside rested several faded notebooks, an old brass compass, and a thick manila envelope sealed with yellowing tape. Across the front, written in my father's unmistakable handwriting, were only 6 simple words. "For Ethan. Open only if necessary." My fingertips traced the familiar handwriting, while every lesson my father had ever taught me echoed in the back of my mind. He never wasted words. He never prepared for imaginary problems. If he had hidden something away with instructions this specific, he had expected one day I might need it. And somehow, long before Claire Whitmore ever imagined turning my mountain home into her private retreat, my father had already prepared the first move that would change everything. I waited until I returned to my hotel room before opening the envelope. The old paper carried that unmistakable scent of dust, cedar, and machine oil that always seemed to cling to my father's workshop. Inside lay several folded survey drawings, handwritten notes, and one thick document wrapped in wax paper to protect it from moisture. At first glance it looked ordinary, just another engineering file covered with measurements and inspection notes. Then I unfolded the largest blueprint across the desk, and everything suddenly made sense. It was not a blueprint for the cabin. It was the complete engineering file for the Eagle Creek Bridge. Every support beam, every concrete footing, every steel connection plate had been carefully documented in my father's handwriting. Across the top, stamped in blue ink by the county engineer's office in 1984, were the words private access structure. Beneath that was another phrase I had almost forgotten from my own engineering training. Exclusive maintenance responsibility. I read every page twice. Then a third time. The bridge was never dedicated to the county. It was never transferred to public use. It had never been included within the homeowners association boundaries because the association did not even exist when the bridge was designed and approved. Legally, it remained a privately owned access structure maintained entirely at the owner's discretion. My father had even included copies of inspection correspondence from nearly 20 years earlier. One letter from the county transportation office thanked him for voluntarily maintaining the crossing because it reduced emergency response times in the surrounding forest. Another confirmed that all maintenance decisions rested solely with the recorded owner. Then I reached the final page. It was a signed maintenance covenant recorded alongside the original property survey decades ago. The language was surprisingly simple. If structural concerns were identified by the owner or the owner's licensed representative, access could be immediately restricted until repairs or replacement were completed. There was no requirement to seek approval from neighboring property owners. There was no obligation to provide alternate access. Safety came first. I leaned back in my chair while the quiet hum of the hotel air conditioner filled the room. My father had not hidden a weapon. He had hidden a responsibility. The bridge was never just a crossing over a creek. It was a piece of private infrastructure with legal protections most people would never think to investigate. Suddenly, another memory surfaced. I was about 12 years old, sitting beside him underneath the bridge while he tightened bolts on one of the steel bearing plates. I had asked why he inspected it every spring, even though it looked perfectly fine. He smiled without looking up from his wrench. "Bridges fail from the things people cannot see," he said. "The smart owner never waits until something breaks." At the time, I thought he was teaching me engineering. Now I realized he had also been teaching me ownership. Early the next morning, I drove to the regional transportation office carrying the original engineering file, certified property records, and my professional engineering license. The building smelled of fresh coffee, printer toner, and old drafting paper. A senior bridge inspector named Laura Bennett greeted me after reviewing my credentials. She listened carefully while I explained the unexpected occupation of my property, but she never commented on the dispute itself. Instead, she focused entirely on the bridge documentation. Together we reviewed inspection intervals, maintenance history, age calculations, and freeze-thaw exposure records dating back decades. Laura finally nodded toward one photograph showing weathering along several timber deck planks. "This structure has served well," she said. "But given its age and the increase in traffic you described, I would recommend a full engineering assessment before allowing continued unrestricted use." She was not taking sides. She was simply doing her job. As licensed engineers, both of us understood that public safety always outweighed convenience. She prepared the necessary inspection request while I completed the owner's authorization paperwork. Every signature followed established procedures. Every recommendation relied upon documented engineering standards rather than opinions. By late afternoon, an official inspection had been scheduled for the following morning. Driving back toward the mountain, I rolled down the truck window and breathed in the cool autumn air, carrying the familiar scent of pine and distant rain. The road climbed steadily through granite cliffs and golden aspens shimmering beneath the afternoon sun. Somewhere ahead, Claire Whitmore was probably planning another weekend retreat for association members, completely unaware that the mountain she believed she controlled depended entirely upon a structure she had never bothered to understand. She had spent months decorating the cabin, replacing furniture, hanging signs, and welcoming guests. She believed ownership began at the front porch. My father had known better all along. Real ownership often began several hundred yards earlier, where every visitor crossed a bridge that still answered to only one name. The following morning began with the sharp scent of damp pine needles and fresh mountain air drifting through the open window of my truck as I parked beside Eagle Creek. Thin ribbons of mist floated just above the water, while the steady rush beneath the bridge sounded exactly as it had every spring since I was a child. At precisely 8 o'clock, 2 county vehicles rolled onto the gravel turnout, followed by a pickup carrying Laura Bennett and another licensed bridge inspector. Nobody arrived with flashing lights or dramatic speeches. They carried clipboards, laser measuring tools, moisture meters, and decades of engineering experience. That alone made me smile. Real authority rarely needed to announce itself. Claire noticed the county trucks less than 15 minutes later. Her white sport utility vehicle appeared around the bend, stopping abruptly near the bridge. She climbed out wearing expensive hiking boots that still looked brand new and walked toward us with the confident stride of someone expecting another easy victory. "What exactly is going on here?" she demanded. Laura answered before I could speak. She introduced herself, displayed her county identification, and explained that the privately owned access structure was undergoing a scheduled engineering assessment requested by the recorded owner. Claire immediately laughed. "This is a community bridge," she insisted. "The association has used it for months." Laura calmly replied, "Use does not determine ownership, ma'am." Then the inspection continued without another word. I watched the engineers move methodically from one end of the bridge to the other. Moisture readings, deck deflection measurements, connection plate inspections, timber core samples. Every bolt received attention. Every support beam was photographed. The quiet tapping of inspection hammers echoed across the creek, while the smell of wet cedar mixed with cool mountain air. Claire paced impatiently beside her vehicle, making several phone calls that became noticeably shorter as time passed. Around noon, Laura walked toward me carrying a clipboard. "Given the documented increase in traffic and the age of several structural members," she said, "we are recommending immediate closure pending comprehensive rehabilitation." Her tone remained purely professional. There was no excitement, no drama, just engineering. I signed the owner's acknowledgement exactly where indicated. A temporary closure notice was attached to the bridge entrance. 2 portable barricades were positioned across the roadway. Bright orange signs read "Bridge closed. Authorized maintenance only." Claire stared at the signs as though they were written in another language. "You cannot close our entrance," she protested. "People are staying at the retreat." Laura looked at her politely. "The owner has both the authority and the responsibility to restrict access when structural safety is in question." Claire turned toward me with obvious disbelief. "You planned this." I answered honestly. "I requested an inspection after reviewing maintenance records." That was the truth. Nothing more, nothing less. Throughout the afternoon, additional contractors arrived, not with demolition equipment, but with survey instruments, safety fencing, and temporary supports. My engineering firm had already arranged for a complete rehabilitation proposal because I intended to preserve the bridge for another generation. Before any repair work could begin, however, the structure had to remain closed. Safety regulations left no room for negotiation. By early evening, the mountain felt strangely quiet. The usual stream of sport utility vehicles heading toward the cabin had disappeared. Guests who had driven out earlier that morning now stood on the opposite side of Eagle Creek looking back toward the retreat with puzzled expressions. Delivery trucks turned around at the barricades after reading the closure notice. Landscapers canceled appointments. A catering company called asking why the road had suddenly become unavailable. Every answer remained exactly the same. The bridge was temporarily closed pending rehabilitation. Nobody argued with the official notice once they saw county inspection signatures attached beneath mine. Claire continued making phone calls from her porch while association board members gathered around her in increasingly anxious conversations. Even from several hundred yards away, I could hear the frustration in their voices carried by the mountain breeze. They had invested enormous effort transforming my family's cabin into an exclusive retreat, yet none of them had ever considered asking who maintained the only access across Eagle Creek. As the sun settled behind the western ridgeline, golden light reflected across the weathered timber rails my father had inspected year after year. I rested one hand against the familiar cedar railing and quietly remembered his words. Bridges fail from the things people cannot see. Standing there beside the official closure notice, I realized he had never been talking only about engineering. Sometimes the smallest overlooked detail quietly supports everything built on top of it. And the people who ignore that truth usually discover it only after the entire plan comes to a complete stop. By sunrise the next morning, the entire atmosphere on the mountain had changed. The cheerful conversations that had floated across my porch only 24 hours earlier had been replaced by the low murmur of worried voices echoing through the trees. The smell of fresh coffee still drifted from the cabin chimney, but now it mixed with the scent of diesel from utility trucks parked at the barricades below the bridge. Nobody crossed Eagle Creek. Nobody ignored the closure signs. The county inspection report had already been uploaded into the transportation database, making the restriction official until rehabilitation work was completed. Claire stood near the entrance with a stack of papers tucked beneath one arm, greeting every disappointed guest with the same practiced smile she had used on me. She insisted the inconvenience would be temporary. She blamed unexpected maintenance. She promised refunds, alternate accommodations, and future discounts. But every explanation raised another question she could not answer. Why had the association invested so much money into a property when it did not control the only legal access? By late morning, her confidence began to crack. I watched from the opposite side of the creek as a board member pointed repeatedly toward the bridge closure notice before shaking his head in frustration. Another loaded luggage into an expensive sport utility vehicle while talking animatedly on his phone. Two contractors refused to unload building materials after reading the county inspection order. A cleaning service canceled its weekly appointment. Even the food delivery company turned around without crossing the barricades. Every business made the same decision because every business recognized official engineering restrictions. Reality was slowly replacing assumptions. Around noon, my attorney arrived carrying 2 organized binders filled with certified records from the county courthouse. We met at the transportation office instead of the mountain because the legal process belonged on paper, not in arguments beside a driveway. Across the conference table sat Claire, 2 association board members, and their attorney. The room smelled faintly of coffee, printer toner, and fresh legal pads. Nobody raised their voice. Nobody interrupted. My attorney simply placed one certified document after another on the table. Original warranty deed, property tax history, recorded surveys, easement descriptions, the bridge maintenance covenant. Finally, he produced the original engineering file my father had preserved decades earlier along with the county, recording information confirming it had never been transferred into public ownership or association control. Claire's attorney quietly reviewed every page before requesting a brief recess. When everyone returned 20 minutes later, the atmosphere had completely changed. Instead of discussing community improvements, the conversation centered on unauthorized occupancy, potential civil liability, and restoration of private property. Claire no longer smiled. She stared silently at the documents while occasionally flipping through her own folder, as though hoping another explanation might somehow appear between the pages. It never did. The association's recently printed parcel maps could not erase decades of recorded county history. Modern assumptions could not replace original surveys. Fresh landscaping invoices could not create ownership where none had ever existed. My attorney remained calm throughout the meeting. He never demanded revenge. He never threatened anyone. He simply requested immediate voluntary surrender of the property, removal of all association signs, return of every personal item, and reimbursement for documented damages associated with unauthorized occupation. The county mediator nodded after reviewing the evidence. The recorded ownership is clear, she said. The association should begin cooperating with an orderly transition. Those few words carried more weight than every speech Claire had delivered on my porch. 3 days later, I drove back up the mountain beneath clear blue skies. The barricades still protected the bridge while engineers finalized the rehabilitation schedule, but with county authorization, I crossed on foot after completing the required safety procedures. The cabin looked strangely quiet. Association banners had disappeared. Decorative welcome signs were stacked neatly beside the driveway, waiting to be removed. Through the front window, I could see movers carefully carrying furniture toward waiting trucks. Claire stood on the porch holding a small cardboard box containing framed photographs they had taken down from the walls. When she noticed me approaching, she looked tired rather than angry. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Finally, she handed me a ring of replacement keys without making excuses. "We thought the property had been forgotten," she said softly. I accepted the keys and looked past her toward the familiar stone fireplace, where my father's blue coffee mug sat exactly where it belonged once again. "A place is only forgotten," I answered, "when people stop respecting the truth about who built it." She lowered her eyes, stepped aside, and quietly walked down the porch steps while the mountain breeze carried the clean scent of cedar through the open front door. For the first time since returning home, nothing stood between me and the life my family had worked so hard to preserve. 6 months later, the mountain looked exactly the way my father always hoped it would. The first thing visitors noticed was not a fancy entrance sign or matching outdoor furniture. It was the clean scent of cedar carried by the morning breeze, the sound of Eagle Creek flowing beneath a bridge that had been carefully restored instead of simply patched, and the quiet feeling that nothing on the mountain existed to impress strangers. It existed because generations had cared enough to build it correctly. The rehabilitation project took nearly 4 months to complete. Every aging timber deck plank was replaced with pressure-treated lumber designed for another generation of mountain winters. Steel connection plates were cleaned, reinforced where necessary, and protected with modern corrosion coatings. New guardrails matched the original design my father had drawn decades earlier. We even reused several of the original cedar posts after carefully restoring them because history deserves preservation whenever possible. When the county performed the final inspection, Laura Bennett smiled as she signed the completion report. "Your father would have approved," she said. I looked across the bridge toward the cabin, and for the first time since coming home, I believed that too. Inside the house, life slowly returned to familiar rhythms. My father's blue enamel coffee mug sat once again beside the stone fireplace every morning. The old rocking chair returned to its place on the porch after I repaired one loose armrest. Family photographs covered the mantel again, replacing decorative signs that had never belonged there. Even the smell inside the cabin changed. Fresh paint and artificial air fresheners disappeared, replaced by cedar logs, wood smoke, black coffee, and the faint scent of old books that had survived another chapter of the mountain's history. Walter Simmons recovered well enough to resume his monthly visits, although he insisted on bringing homemade cinnamon rolls instead of climbing ladders. Helen laughed every time he claimed retirement was overrated. We spent one Saturday afternoon organizing my father's workshop exactly the way he had always kept it. Every wrench returned to its hook. Every survey notebook found its place on the shelf. Some people inherit money. I inherited responsibility, and somehow that felt more valuable. The legal process continued quietly in the background. The Homeowners Association formally acknowledged my ownership, reimbursed documented restoration expenses, and agreed to remove every reference suggesting the property had ever belonged to the community. Their insurance carrier handled most of the financial settlement after reviewing the recorded documents that should have been examined long before anyone moved into the cabin. Claire resigned as president before the next board election. I never celebrated that decision because watching someone lose a position never interested me as much as watching the truth finally receive the respect it deserved. A few weeks after everything ended, I received a handwritten letter from Claire. She apologized for assuming that silence meant abandonment and admitted she had trusted recent paperwork without asking enough questions about the property's history. I appreciated the honesty more than the apology itself. Mistakes become lessons only when someone accepts responsibility for making them. I folded the letter and placed it inside the same metal cash box where my father had hidden the bridge records years earlier. It belonged there with the rest of the mountain's history. Before winter arrived, I installed one simple sign at the entrance to the bridge. Not a warning, not a threat, just a small cedar plaque carved by a local craftsman. It read, "Private Bridge. Please respect the property beyond this point." Nothing more, nothing less. Most people who crossed it never knew the story behind those few words, and that was perfectly fine with me. Every now and then I still walk onto the middle of the bridge just before sunrise. The mountain is completely silent except for flowing water, rustling pine branches, and the distant call of hawks riding the morning wind. I usually rest one hand against the smooth cedar railing where my father once stood beside me and remember something he said during one of our spring inspections. Strong foundations are rarely noticed until someone forgets they are there. Back then I thought he was talking about engineering. Now I understand he was talking about life, family, honesty, and ownership all at the same time. People often believe justice arrives with loud speeches, dramatic victories, or public humiliation. In my experience, it usually arrives much more quietly. It comes through old records preserved by careful hands, responsibilities honored across generations, and the patience to let facts stand longer than assumptions. My mountain never needed revenge. It simply needed someone willing to remember what had always been true. Justice is not loud. It is smart. It is patient. And sooner or later, it always finds the only bridge that leads home.